Welcome to Seminars at Steamboat. I'm Joella West, Seminars Chair. It's hard to believe that we're approaching the end of our 2021 season. In today's talk, we return again to a scary subject, one made more complicated by the events of the past week. We select our topics a year in advance, and although we sometimes ask ourselves whether they will still be relevant when our audience walks into the pavilion or clicks on watch on our website, we're often amazed at the immediacy of the issues. As always, we bring you a presentation by an expert in this area, followed by an expanded opportunity for audience questions, which we certainly hope you will take advantage of. To participate in the Q&A, just click on the chat which appears at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any time during the talk. Each talk and the follow-up audience questions are recorded and captioned and posted on our website within a few days after the event. Please take advantage of the opportunity to revisit a discussion or recommend it to friends. You'll also find information on our website about our final event of the season coming up on August 23rd, and you can also view events from years past. Our nonpartisan public policy discussions are always free to the public, and we depend on your generosity to continue to make that possible. So we make it very easy to make a contribution now or at any time. Just click on the donate button at the top of the page. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, and KUNC Community Radio of Northern Colorado makes this season's talks available on their website at kunc.org's Seminars podcast landing page. Special thanks to today's sponsors, Kate and Malcolm Hawk and Lonnie Samford. Our speaker today is Eric Edelman, and here to introduce him is board member Ken Krieg.
Thanks, Joella. It's my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Eric Edelman to Seminars tonight. Eric retired as a career minister from the United States Foreign Service in 2009. He is currently practitioner in residence at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, a counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a senior fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and a member of the board of directors of the United States Institute of Peace. Ambassador Edelman co-chaired the National Defense Strategy Commission in 2017 and 2018. Congress empowered the commission in law, and Eric, along with retired Admiral and Chief Naval Officer Gary Roughead, led a panel of a dozen accomplished national security thought leaders through a systematic review of the nation's defense strategy. It was a powerful report from a bipartisan group, and it helped reshape a series of debates that continue today. While in the Foreign Service, Ambassador Edelman served as U.S. ambassador to both the Republic of Finland and the Republic of Turkey in the Clinton and Bush administrations, respectively, and was principal deputy assistant to the Vice President for National Security Affairs. In other assignments, he has been Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of State, Special Assistant to the Secretary of State, George Shultz, and he served in the State Department's Operations Center and the embassies in Prague, Moscow, and Tel Aviv, where he was a member of the U.S. Middle East delegation to the West Bank and Gaza autonomy talks. I had the great pleasure to work alongside Eric in the Pentagon when he served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2005 to 2009. Eric holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University and a PhD in diplomatic history from Yale. Several weeks ago, James Bruce spoke to Seminars in a presentation entitled The Foreign Intelligence Threat to the US, Russia, China, and Other Bad Actors. Dr. Bruce provided a high-level review of the current and evolving threats to the United States and its interests. With the threat as a background, the question then becomes, what does the nation do to advance its interests? That is Eric's challenge tonight. As Joella noted during Eric's talk, if you have a question that comes to mind, please provide it in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and I will use them during the Q&A process. Eric, thank you for joining us to take us through the prospects for U.S. national security, defense strategy, and policy. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, for that very generous introduction. I have to say it was an incredible pleasure on my part to be Ken's colleague and his sort of counterpart on the policy side of the House and the Pentagon back in the Bush 43 administration. And thanks to Joella as well and to Seminars at Steamboat for inviting me tonight. And thanks to everybody for tuning in, because I think it's an important subject and I appreciate everybody's time. I am going to make some observations about the process of how we think about national defense strategy, how we arrive at it, the specific challenges we face today. And I will be basing it a lot on the experience that I had with Admiral Roughead in chairing the National Defense Strategy Commission report, which you can find online at the U.S. Institute of Peace website. I think that report, although it's already 3 years old, remains quite current today. And I know, for instance, Ranking Member Inhofe used it during the course of the Senate Arms Services Committee markup of the National Defense Authorization Act and the Biden defense budget, which I will mention later in my remarks. But it would be, I think, very difficult to embark on this topic without addressing the events of the last week that Joella adverted to in her introductory remarks. What's happened in Afghanistan over the last week and the U.S. withdrawal clearly is going to have major impact on the prospects for U.S. national defense strategy. I'll make a few observations at the top of this session and probably advert to it as well during the course of my remarks. But I'm also happy to engage with folks who want to talk more about it in detail or drill down in the Q&A session. So my first observation would be that no matter how much one tries to spin this, the debacle that has unfolded over the past week is going to be an enormous blow to U.S. Standing in the world and the prospects for at least alliance relationships in any national defense strategy going forward. And you can see that reflected in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and other major news publications that are taking soundings in capitals around the world. Second observation I would make is that although the president's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was justified, at least in part, by the need to refocus on the challenge presented to us by the People's Republic of China, the sort of shambolic exit from Kabul is both going to embolden China and jihadists worldwide, and that's going to heighten the cost of deterring the former and will increase the likelihood that we will have to divert more resources to fighting the latter. On the China side, I would just note that China Global Times, which is a propaganda outlet of the communist regime in China, in the last 2 days has had successive editorials, one about Hong Kong and one about Taiwan, that has warned the residents of Hong Kong and Taiwan that they can't count on the United States to support them if they get into a conflict with the People's Republic. And I think that's just a foretaste of what's to come. The third observation I would make is that because our commitments overseas are much less divisible in different parts of the world than people sometimes think, this administration has really set back this event has set back the Biden administration's effort to assert that America is back and willing to step into a leadership position around the world. And you can see that as well being questioned by various political figures around the world. My fourth observation is that how we do security assistance with our partners around the world has been thrown into relief in the collapse of the Afghan army. There'll be many, many postmortems of why the Afghan army failed. The idea that the Afghan army didn't want to fight, I think, is not credible in light of the 50,000 plus casualties they've taken in combat over the last 5 or 6 years when they have been in the lead of the combat operations. But I do think what will emerge, at least as one of the reasons for the failure, among others, is that we've trained the Afghan army to fight the way we do, to rely on overwhelming information dominance, awesome air power, contract logistical support to keep aircraft, both rotary and fixed wing, in the air and vehicles moving on the road, as well as the kind of unique mission planning capabilities that we bring. And when we pulled them out of the equation, it I think sapped the will of Afghans to fight, and made the debacle that we've seen unfold all the more likely. I would note as well that this is not a new problem. My predecessor, many times removed as Undersecretary of Defense, blowtorch Bob Comer, wrote a famous study for RAND back in the 1970s called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, in which he reproved the US military for having done precisely the same thing with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam in the 1970s. So this, unfortunately, is a recurrent pattern about how we provide security assistance, and it's one of the issues I think people are going to have to take a look at very seriously. And then my final observation about the potential impact of Afghanistan on national defense strategy is that however bad this is, and I think it's quite bad, the United States can recover. I mean, after all, we did recover from the withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975, to which the Afghan withdrawal is now sadly being compared. But we shouldn't underestimate the cost of recovery. If you think back to 1975, and then think back to what came in the national security arena in the immediate years afterwards, the Mayaguez affair, the advent of Cuban adventurism in Africa, the Nicaraguan revolution, and the rise of the Sandinistas, the Iranian Revolution and the hostage taking, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. A lot of bad things followed from the US failure and the perception of defeat in Vietnam. And I think we need to be on the alert for similar kinds of dangerous trends developing in the next several years. But recovery is possible. I guess that's the silver lining in what otherwise is a very cloudy picture. So with those observations, let me turn to defense strategy, writ large. And for my sins, I not only chaired the 2018 National Defense Panel created by Congress, but I served on its two predecessors, the National Defense Panel of 2014 and the Independent Panel to review the QDR of 2010. And the 2014 National Defense Panel report begins with a very simple sentence about defense strategy. It says, any defense strategy has to start with a very simple question. What is it that you're trying to defend, and why? Another way of putting that is, what are the ends of your national security policy? And what is it that you have to do to secure them? Those are, of course, the means. And how will you employ those means to secure these ends? And that is the ways. And this triptych of ends, ways, and means you see repeatedly. I think Ken and I probably saw it a million times on briefing slides in the Pentagon. And while it can be a kind of stultifying, formulaic approach to strategy, it remains crucial in terms of understanding how to build a strategy and what your strategy ought to be. Writing in the midst of World War II, Walter Lippmann, in his book Foreign Policy, The Shield of the Republic, wrote that national security policy, and now I quote, consists in bringing into balance, with a comfortable surplus of power in reserve, the nation's commitments and the nation's power. The constant preoccupation of the true statesman is to achieve this balance. Lippmann's formulation has sometimes been called the Lippmann Test or the solvency test for American national security policy, with the idea that just like a budget at home, you have to have your objectives and the resources to accomplish them, your meet your commitments in balance, and then you're solvent. Now, if you find yourself out of balance, and for reasons I'll explain, I think we are a little bit out of balance now. There are ways to deal with that. One is you can reduce your commitments. You can say, there are things we will defend and things that we will not. And President Biden, for better or worse, has just made one of those decisions in Afghanistan. We've made decisions like that in the past. In 1950, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, gave a speech about America's national security perimeter in East Asia. And he quite intentionally left Korea out of it. 6 months later, the North Koreans invaded South Korea with the blessing of Stalin and Mao, and American policymakers decided that even though it hadn't been part of their declared national security objectives, the defense of Korea was important for other reasons, not least of which was to reassure European allies who had just signed the Washington Treaty creating the NATO alliance that the United States was willing to defend places in the world where it found its forces. So reducing commitments is one option. The second option, of course, is to increase resources, to raise the top line of the defense budget, for instance. This is something ultimately that President Carter began in the late 1970s after some of the events that I mentioned in my earlier remarks, and which President Reagan continued and increased. And that is one way to deal with a set of commitments that are out of whack with your resources. And the third is to assume risk. And that, for instance, is what President Eisenhower did when he declared the new look at the end of the Korean War, concerned that the United States was spending too much on defense, and that it needed to be prepared to have a national defense strategy for, as Eisenhower put it, the long haul. President Eisenhower agreed on a strategy that would cut spending on conventional forces, but rely very heavily on what Secretary of State John Foster Dulles called massive retaliation, the threat of using nuclear weapons to hold the line against America's adversaries. And assuming risk is a potential approach as well. The 2018 National Defense Strategy, for instance, says that the United States should be prepared to assume more risk in the Middle East in order to be able to reprioritize its defense efforts to deal with near-peer challengers like Russia and especially China, which everyone agrees is the pacing threat for national security. The problem that we found on the commission when we examined our colleagues in the Pentagon about this is everybody had a different idea about what risk was. Was it assuming risk in the fight against ISIL in Syria and Iraq? Was it assuming risk in Afghanistan? Was it assuming risk in containing Iran? Clearly, right now, we're seeing what can happen when you make a faulty assumption about risk, because I think that's what we see playing out in Afghanistan. So what is it that we, in fact, in the United States want to try and defend? What are the core national security interests that we have? Since World War II, there has been a kind of consensus answer to that. After the enormous exertions of the First and Second World War, the national security elite in the United States, and by that I mean the senior military officers, politicians, diplomats, and congressional leaders who were involved in international affairs, came to a kind of consensus position that the United States could not allow a foreign power to dominate either Europe or East Asia. So in World War II, obviously, it was Germany and Japan. But after the Second World War, it quickly became a concern that the Soviet Union might dominate those two places. And over time, the Middle East was added to this mix because of the role it played in European reconstruction and providing the hydrocarbon resources for Europe to rebuild its economy after World War II. And so the consensus position, very much a departure from the previous American reluctance to engage in political commitments abroad and alliances, became one that relied on alliances, both a multilateral alliance in Europe, NATO, with an integrated military command, a series of bilateral alliances in East Asia, the so-called hub and spoke model, which included a bilateral security treaty with Japan, after the Korean War with the Republic of Korea, and roughly at the same time with the Republic of China, Taiwan, which was abrogated in 1979 when we fully normalized our relations with the People's Republic, and was replaced by domestic US legislation, the Taiwan Relations Act, which doesn't imply a defense commitment to Taiwan, but does suggest that the US will provide the means for Taiwan to defend itself against forcible incorporation into the People's Republic. So alliances, open trading order, basically oriented around the general agreement on trade and tariffs that was reached in the late 1940s, as well as the World Bank and the IMF, all became a part of the American national strategy that was based on forward defense and the ability to project power into these key regions of the world. And what was all of that meant to accomplish? Well, first, it was meant, first and foremost, to defend the American homeland. Second, it was meant to preserve America's access to sea, to air, to space, and cyberspace, to maintain stability in these key regions so that the United States didn't face so-called salami slicing tactics where one country after another would fall under communist dominion and control by Moscow and the Soviet Union. Promotion of an international order that was favorable to our interests and values, and that is something that has gone back and forth in American politics. There's always a conflict between ideals and interests, but it's founded in something very fundamental to Americans, which is the notion that the founders had, which was echoed by Lincoln, that it would not be possible for democratic self-government, which the founders knew had been very rarely successful in world history, to survive and prosper in a world made up of non-democracies that were hostile to democratic self-government. And then finally, a commitment to global public goods, the willingness to use America's might to deal with disasters worldwide, to deal with global health crises. And of course, we're in the midst of one right now with the COVID pandemic. And these kinds of global public goods have been a part of the strategy as well. After the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, it seemed relatively cheap to maintain this kind of international order. I mean, we had a number of so-called operations other than war, humanitarian interventions, but we also were doing it, increasing our operations tempo at a time that we were cutting the defense budget. We were engaged in the so-called procurement bathtub because we were spending money on operations and maintenance, but not investing in future military technologies. And so we found ourselves after 9/11, and Ken was a big part of this, basically eating the seed corn of the Reagan defense buildup in the 1980s. And from 2001 on, and in some sense that period is maybe just coming to an end this week, we have predominantly been involved in the Defense Department and in defense strategy, worrying the problem of counterterrorism and finding, fixing, and finishing terrorists and terrorist groups. But today, when we looked at this as a commission, we found that the United States is now perhaps facing the most complex and challenging international security environment it's ever faced. If in the Cold War era we had one major challenger, the Soviet Union, with a lot of lesser included cases falling underneath that bipolar challenge, and if in the post-Cold War we were challenged by the problems of fragile and failing states, today we find ourselves facing a myriad of challenges that make the previous, I think, problems that we had to deal with almost pale in comparison. So one, we face the rise of two near-peer great power competitors in the form of China and Russia. The National Defense Strategy of 2018, and again in the interim strategic guidance, the Biden administration will have to do its own national defense strategy, but in the interim strategic guidance that was issued by the Biden administration, the emphasis on great power competition, it was a strong continuity between the Trump and the Biden administrations. Everyone agrees China is the long pole in the tent, and people began to become aware of the China challenge really in 2010 on, when China began to build these islands, these sand spits in the South China Sea, and assert its sovereignty over them. But it also became clear that Russia remains a challenge after the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the ongoing destabilization of Ukraine. And while China is the most important long-term threat, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Russia, at least for the moment, is the only country that presents an existential threat to the existence of the United States because of its large nuclear arsenal. Now, recent revelations about China digging some 200 ICBM silos in the Chinese desert could suggest, it's not completely clear yet, that China aspires to become a nuclear peer of the United States and of Russia. That would be make China an even greater challenge, and the timeline move up quite a bit. But great power competition clearly is one major challenge that the United States is going to be facing for some time. Second trend that we found is that we face regional challengers who either have or aspire to have nuclear weapons. Obviously, North Korea already has tested a nuclear weapon. Iran is creeping closer to having a nuclear weapon with its violations of the JCPOA, which the Trump administration walked out of in 2018. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are potentially other aspirants for nuclear weapons and other nuclear powers that we need to worry about. I mean, in the context of what's happened this week in Afghanistan, I particularly worry about Pakistan. Pakistan has been producing enormous amounts of plutonium. They're on track to have a larger nuclear arsenal than Great Britain's in the near future. But it's not completely clear that Pakistan has emerged from its fragile or failing state status. And the fillip that Islamic extremists in Pakistan will get from the victory of the Taliban is not something to be sneezed at. So there are a number of nuclear potential regional challenges that we face. A third kind of trend line has been this notion of conflict in the gray zone, or sometimes called hybrid warfare. And what we found in the 2018 Commission, and sadly events have only confirmed this, is that we have gray zones that are both regional, that is to say, areas like the Senkaku Islands, where the People's Republic of China uses, militarized naval militia or fishing fleets, proxies, or paramilitary forces to challenge the sovereignty of the Senkakus. We've seen that in the South China Sea. We've seen the use of these little green men or proxies by Russia in Crimea. So we have these regional areas of gray zone conflict, but we also have functional gray zone conflict, which is in the area of cyber or information warfare. And there, what we found, and sadly, again, this has been validated by events, is that the United States is not just in competition with Russia and China in these areas, and others as well, but we're in daily conflict. We've got daily cyber operations against our government systems, against systems in the private sector, and we've got the use not just of state-controlled assets like the GRU in Russia or others, but we've got the Internet Research Agency in Russia. We've got private hackers in China and Russia who are being used, criminal gangs that are being used against us. And of course, the idea of political warfare being waged against the United States is something we've been discussing for a number of years now because of Russian interference in our elections. But I will tell you, if we were having this conversation in Australia, we really would be more focused on Chinese information operations, and the Chinese have been very active in this area as well, and in particular, over spreading misinformation and disinformation about COVID in Europe and in the United States. Fourth, we have the jihadist threat, which is ongoing. Sadly, there are more jihadists worldwide now than there were on 9/11. They're spread more widely. And as I said in my earlier comments, the Taliban victory in Afghanistan is going to be a great recruiting tool for them. They've now got the ability to claim that they've defeated two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And that is going to mean that this threat will continue to metastasize, and I believe we will have to devote more resources to it than had we not quit Afghanistan in such a messy way. We also have, I've got two more trends that I want to get through that we have to face. One is the spread of new technologies that are going to revolutionize warfare, or are already revolutionizing warfare. And there's a list of 10 technologies that, Ken's job was so big when he was Undersecretary of Defense that it was subsequently by legislation split into two. And one of his successors, Michael Griffin, sent a letter to defense industry a few years ago, which listed 10 key technologies. And those are important technologies that we have to be able to be competitive in, if not dominate. And they include artificial intelligence, robotics, hypersonics, microelectronics, quantum computing, directed energy, space, both in the offense and defense side of it, cybersecurity, missile defense, and nuclear modernization. And those technologies, some in combination, are going to change how wars are planned and fought. And we are behind in some of those technologies, candidly. And we have to develop a way to ensure the success of our what the 2018 National Security Strategy called the National Security Innovation Base, in order to be competitive with these two challengers, particularly China. Finally, the other challenge for defense strategy that we have faced over the previous decade is budget instability and disinvestment in defense. So under the Budget Control Act, we had a long period of time in which the defense budget was either flat or declining. I mean, under the Budget Control Act, even though the defense budget represented 15% of federal outlays, it was assigned 50% of the cuts that took place under defense, under sequestration, if you had failure to reach budget agreements. We had a series of bipartisan budget agreements that essentially just kept things going, but we had some very serious inconstancy in our defense funding, and there were all sorts of things that went on in the defense budgeting world that made it difficult for DoD to sort of keep up with this evolving technological competition that I was just talking about, including relying for many, many years on continuing resolutions rather than actual defense appropriations, which precluded new starts, There was an effort to try and make up for this by shoving money into the so-called OCOs. In Ken's and my day, they were defense supplemental bills, which were meant to fund the ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. But all of this led to a lot of dysfunction in DoD. I'm frequently asked, and I'm sure people will want to, know about this in Q&A. How is it that we spend so much more than our rivals, and the next 7 or 8 countries in the world on defense, but we're not spending, you're telling us we're not spending enough? Well, part of the problem is we spend 50% of our budget on personnel, healthcare, and retirement. And the healthcare part of it is like healthcare costs in the economy at large, eating an increasingly large share of the budget. Second, of course, our adversaries have regional responsibilities while we have global responsibilities. And we spent the last 20 years fighting counterterrorism rather than investing in technologies of the future. We've also allowed the Department of Defense's analytical capabilities to decay. We used to have capabilities for matching force on force, modeling that and seeing how we would do against putative adversaries like China and Russia. Those capabilities have significantly decayed. And we haven't been developing any new concepts for how we will fight, if we have to, against Russia and China. This is an increasing problem because the American way of war was to take the Gulf War, for instance, back in 1990 as an example. The supposition of most of our war plans is the adversary strikes and makes some kind of a gain or advance, like Saddam Hussein taking Kuwait, and then we build an iron mountain of troops and equipment over time by air and sea, and then we retake the territory that's been lost. China and Russia have watched this for some time, and they've developed an antidote to that, and it's commonly referred to in the defense world as A2AD, which means anti-access area denial capabilities. Both Russia, particularly China, but both Russia and China have developed these capabilities that make it difficult for us to operate that way. They make it, our assumptions have always been that we'll have unmolested access to air and sea points of departure and entry to the theater. And we can no longer count on that. Yet we haven't really come up with a way to think about fighting or describe how we would fight that that meets that challenge. And the result of that is that our ability to deter Russia and China has been slowly ebbing and declining over the years. Reorienting the Department of Defense away from what it's been doing for the last 20 years, which is fighting terrorists, and engaging in great power competition is going to be an enormous, enormous challenge. We came up with some new strategic concepts in the light of Russia's nuclear buildup in the Cold War, the Soviet nuclear buildup in the Cold War. And we were able to use new technologies developed by some of Ken's predecessors in his job, particularly stealth and precision-guided munitions in what was called the second offset strategy, to underpin a concept called air-land battle that indicated we would attack Soviet forces in the rear. We wouldn't wait for them to roll all the way to the Atlantic coast. We would attack them in the rear with precision munitions and information dominance. And it was those developments that led the Russians to theorize about a revolution in military affairs that ultimately led them to invest so much in defense that they bankrupted themselves. We don't have a similar effort to develop new defense concepts right now, and we need to, I would say, supercharge that. The National Defense Strategy of 2018 and the Biden Interim Strategic Guidance, as I said, has prioritized China for good reason. But where we are now, going back to where I began, is We have extensive commitments to treaty allies in Europe and in Asia, and special relations that we have with people in the Middle East, but we don't have the resources to actually execute all those commitments. So we are dangerously out of balance. It's one reason why the commission that I co-chaired recommended that to execute the 2018 strategy and the guidance that the Biden administration is operating under now, they may have different guidance later, would require something like 3 to 5% real growth in defense budget. At the time that we proposed that, that seemed like a lot of money, but given the amounts of money that we have been talking about and have approved for expenditure, $1.1 trillion infrastructure package and a $3.5 trillion package in the offing, that amount of money actually seems much less daunting than it might have in the past. What are the consequences if we don't, in fact, bring our commitments and the resources devoted to them into some kind of balance? We actually looked at that in the commission, and we decided to sketch out some vignettes, and I'll share them with you. Doug, if you could put the slides up. We did these vignettes in 2018, and they appear in the slides that you're looking at now, just as they did. The only thing I've updated is the dates, because we had some of them set to go off in 2019 or 2020, and those dates have already passed. But so one of the ones I'm most worried about is Taiwan. I mentioned the China Global Times editorial about Taiwan. You hear a lot more saber rattling from the People's Republic about Taiwan. And right now, if we ended up in a conflict over Taiwan, if China made the decision that they wanted to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence, or they just wanted by a certain date to incorporate Taiwan as part of one China, they could conduct a massive set of attacks using the land attack missile capabilities and holding us at bay with their long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, and make it extremely difficult for the U.S. to operate. And one thing that Americans have become used to in terms of Desert Storm and Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom is very quick American combat victories when major combat is going on, as opposed to the counterinsurgency part, which is more complicated. But the idea of losing a major conflict, I think, is sort of not one that Americans have really come to grips with. So Taiwan is certainly one. Can we go to the next slide, if you would, Doug? North Korea. We could easily find ourselves in a conflict with North Korea, and the potential for nuclear escalation as North Korea builds its nuclear arsenal, not only in number, but in the diversity of its delivery systems. I mean, the North Koreans are building an arsenal now that has not only long-range ICBMs, but they're also clearly trying to develop submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The potential for a conflict that would raise the risk of nuclear escalation or defeat is very, very real. Of course, this came up several times, at least early in the Trump administration, but it's still out there, and it's one we have to, I think, be concerned about. By the way, if we just had a conflict that was restricted to conventional munitions, the prospects would not be very good, because the North Koreans have enormous number of artillery tubes pointed at Seoul, Korea, and have threatened to turn it into a ring of fire. The estimates of casualties are quite high, including American casualties, because we've got a lot of not only American troops, but dependents and American citizens living in South Korea. So that's a second conflict to worry about, that we could either face nuclear escalation or lose. The third, Russia. We talk in this one about a potential conflict that gets ignited because of the Balkans and escalates from there. The Belarus conflict or the Belarus crisis that has emerged, and Belarus's use of air piracy and kidnapping as a sort of state instrument, is one that could also lead to a conflict. And you see, just in the press in recent days, the foreign minister of Latvia expressing concern about Belarus's weaponization of migration, and that may increase as we start to get Afghan refugees pouring through to use against the Baltic states and keep the pressure on. So that's a Russian potential case. I mentioned that some of the concern about China as a rising adversary came from the activities in the South China Sea in 2010. But so much energy flows through the South China Sea, as you see in this slide, 14% of our trade passing through that, that the potential for a loss of access or a military conflict that arises from that is not insubstantial. And then finally, cyber attacks, and this is all too real because we've been going through this throughout last year and the spring with the Solar Winds cyber attack, but also the Colonial Pipeline and the food companies that have been attacked. President Biden, at his summit meeting with President Putin, gave him a list of 16 areas of American critical infrastructure that the Russians need to keep their hands off of with the cyber in the cyber game. It's not yet clear to me whether that deterrence message was received and whether that will, in fact, deter Russia. There's a danger that, in fact, that kind of message will be interpreted by Putin as, if I keep my hands off these 16 things, I can attack everything else. And so we'll have to see about whether that enhances our deterrent. As I said about the commission report, we recommended a 3 to 5% annual increase. The Trump budgets just barely got over the 3% mark. President Trump liked to brag that he had rebuilt the U.S. military. I think it's fair to say that the Trump budgets bought back a little bit of the readiness we had lost because of the defense cuts that took place under the Budget Control Act, but they weren't sufficient to make the kinds of investments in future capabilities that we are going to need. This year's budget under the Trump budget was going to be flat to slightly declining. The Biden budget was, in fact, a decline. And interestingly, though, the Senate Armed Services Committee, when it marked up the National Defense Authorization Act by a vote of 24-1, plussed up that budget by about $25 billion, which got you just north of that 3% bar that we had set in our report. But I think it's clear that money alone will not be enough. It's necessary, but money alone will not be enough to meet the kinds of defense challenges that I've been outlining. We're going to need future capabilities that we can invest in now. We're going to need new concepts for how to employ them. And we need to be able to enhance our ability to deter in the short run, both in Europe and in Asia. And in the end of the day, all of this discussion of defense strategy is about deterrence. None of us wants to build a defense strategy to actually fight a war. The point is to be able to make yourself such a challenging target for your adversaries that you never have to go to war. And that's the art, I think, of crafting a national defense strategy. And I think I've probably gone on a little bit too long, so let me stop there, Ken, and open it up to you with my observation that the best defense strategy is one that deters, not one that provokes a war.
Fantastic. Thanks, Eric. It's a huge topic, and you did a nice job of kind of focusing in on the transition from history to today and the challenges that we have lying ahead. That question of deterrence. It was one thing to deter in a kind of a bipolar contest where the two parties had very different interests in a very similar structure. And they built over time a discussion about what it meant to deter each other. How do you think about deterrence in a multi-party world with so many different natures of interests and risks at play?
It's a great question. There are several, I think, problems with sort of deterrence. And by the way, it's an active discussion, as you know, Ken, in the Department of Defense now. Secretary Austin has talked about the importance of what he calls integrated deterrence, which is, trying to figure out how you use not just nuclear weapons, but all the military instruments and all the instruments of national power, not just military, but including intelligence, economic, diplomacy, et cetera, in order to deter. So there are a couple of things I would observe, particularly with regard to nuclear deterrence, but it goes more broadly than just nuclear, because obviously, there's nuclear deterrence and there's conventional deterrence. And the first problem with deterrence is, and a classic problem that we have as Americans is you have to remember that what deters is not what you think deters. It's what your adversary thinks deters. And you never know that with any precision. I mean, you can have intelligence and you can, read their documents to the degree that they state things in public about what they value and what you can hold at risk. But in the end of the day, it's a very uncertain process. And we Americans tend to think that, if it would deter us, it would deter them. And, that's how we got so-called mutual assured destruction, or MAD. That came out of Secretary McNamara's effort to quantify, when he established the PPBS, the Planning, Programming, Budgeting System in the Pentagon, which we still suffer under, the notion that there had to be, how much was enough was the famous question he asked to deter in nuclear weapons. And he first concluded that it was 60% of the population and 75% of industry, and then they changed the numbers. But of course, that was based on what we thought what would deter a good American. But it wasn't necessarily what would deter Russians, who had lost easily 20 million people in World War II. And so it was a different set of calculations for the Russians. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is there's something we tend to call general deterrence, which is, or strategic deterrence, which is how do we prevent the Russians, or now increasingly the Chinese, from deciding that they want to attack the United States with nuclear weapons? Well, that's pretty not easy, but it's relatively easier to do. We've had for years a doctrine of second strike retaliatory capability, which is we could ride out a strike by the Soviets / Russians or the Chinese and still have enough to inflict enormous punishment on them with nuclear weapons so that they would be deterred from attacking us. What's less easy to do is to engage in what we call extended deterrence, which is to deter attacks on our allies. And when you think about the Cold War, almost every major crisis of the Cold War was a function of extended deterrence, whether it was the Berlin crisis in the late 1950s or early 1960s, the Quemoy and Matsu crises of the 1950s, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. These were all crises of extended deterrence. They weren't crises of whether the United States could deter the Soviet Union from attacking it, but whether it could deter them from attacking its allies, or parts, taking parts of its allies slice by slice. And today, I think what we're seeing is essentially an attack on extended deterrence by both Russia and China. You see that in Chinese messaging when the Chinese are telling the Taiwanese and the Hong Kong population, don't count on the Americans. That's really an attack on our extended deterrence. It won't be long before they're telling the Japanese and the Republic of Korea, don't count on the Americans. They're not going to be there to defend you. And the Russians, of course, echo that as well with our Baltic allies, for instance. And so maintaining these, the credibility of our extended deterrent is going to be an issue. And it's you can see that now in the reaction on Afghanistan, because it calls into question our willingness to carry out other commitments. This is what I meant when I said earlier, there's the indivisibility of commitments. I had an experience, I'm not sure if you did, but when President Obama walked away from his own red line with regard to Syrian chemical weapons in 2013, I was hearing nonstop from my former Japanese and Korean colleagues, because they thought that there was an implication there about the U.S. willingness to meet its, defense commitments. The President of the United States said this, and then walked away from it. And just to be bipartisan about it, we did the same thing in Bush 43. President Bush said that in October of 2006, when North Korea tested a nuclear weapon, he said, if we catch them providing nuclear weapons or nuclear technology to either terrorists or known state sponsor of terrorism, we will impose very serious consequences on them. A year later, we caught the North Koreans building a doppelganger of their Yongbyon nuclear reactor in the Syrian desert, not connected in any way to the Syrian electrical grid, and almost certainly part of a Syrian nuclear weapons program. And yet, in the end of the day, we stood by and did nothing. We let the Israelis take care of it.
Yes, one has to be careful about what one establishes as a red line, and then your willingness to live up to it. Thanks to the audience. They've got a lot of interesting questions. Naturally, several of them about Afghanistan, and some pretty thoughtful ones. Successive presidents have talked about ending the long wars, right? Obama, Trump, Biden, all campaigned on it, all made it a big part of their stated policy. But yet it was so hard to enact over time. How, a lot of this will be played out in the hindsight of history as people tear it apart and try to understand it. But what might have some of the elements been in affecting a more positive transaction or a more positive ending of the Afghanistan war or Afghanistan effort? How might we have done it differently?
Yeah, I suspect we're going to have a number of retrospective looks at what we did in Afghanistan over 20 years. I think part of the issue here, I think, is people's memories are somewhat short, and people don't remember what it felt like on September 12th, 2011, after 3,000 of our countrymen had been killed by terrorists who were plotting, their attacks from Afghanistan and the sanctuary they had there. You'll remember, Ken, that when we started the military action on October 7th in 2001, General Abizaid, who was then the deputy commander in CENTCOM, as we began the pummeling of the Taliban positions, said, were bombing Afghanistan forward into the Stone Age. I mean, this was, of course, a play on Curtis LeMay's comments about Vietnam, that we were going to bomb Vietnam back into the Stone Age. But John's comment, I think, captured a important truth about Afghanistan, which is this was one of the poorest countries on earth. And to give you just some sense of the scale, the per capita GDP in Afghanistan today, after 20 years of effort to build the Afghan economy, is something like $600 or $700 a person. The per capita income in Haiti, which is the poorest country in our hemisphere, which tragically has just suffered another horrible, earthquake and natural disaster, on top of everything else that Haiti has suffered, including the assassination of its president. The per capita income in Haiti is $1,200 a year. It's more than twice what it is in Afghanistan. This was a desperately poor society. I remember going over and being briefed on our efforts to build the Afghan military, and 90% of the recruits at the beginning of our effort were illiterate. And we were asking our guys, who were doing the train assist mission, training the Afghan military forces, essentially to teach them how to read and write. They don't teach people how to do that at Fort Kearny. So we were not, this goes back to my earlier point about how we do, security assistance. So the point again, to go back to what I said earlier, we taught them how to fight the way we fight. And they're not capable of executing some of those things without our support. What I think would have made more sense than just pulling out totally was figuring out how we could keep a de minimis presence there to help them with the mission planning, to help them with ISR, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to give them an advantage over the Taliban, and to provide the logistical support to keep the aircraft flying and the trucks and vehicles moving. And we could have done that at, I think, a fairly low level and sustained it over a period of time. Now, I've had people tell me, well, Eric, that's all fine and good, but we were spending $50 billion a year. That number has come down over the last few years. It's less than that, but let's say it's $50 billion a year. The cost of 9/11, when you total it all out, was $3.3 trillion. So, at $50 billion a year for 20 years, I'm ready to pay that cost if that's what it is to keep us from being attacked that way again. We'll see how soon it is before we have the next attack on the homeland. I hope hope it never happens again. But there's going to be a real danger now with us out that we're going to be blind to a lot of what's going on. And so I think there were ways to execute the withdrawal differently. President Biden has every right. He campaigned on it. It's his right to make that decision. I disagree with it, but it's his right. Where I differ, with President Biden and what he said in his speech today and what his colleagues have said is, it's clear they didn't prepare for every eventuality. You don't plan to withdraw 2,500 troops and then reinsert 6,000. That's not anybody's plan, at least in the Pentagon that you and I worked in. And so I think there were better ways to do this. And I think there were a lot of other second and third order consequences that were not factored into this. Like, where are we going to, they keep talking about over the horizon terrorist overwatch. Great. Where? From where? If we fly out of the UAE or Qatar, that's a 6-hour flight and you got to refuel. So that's going to be pretty expensive. And it's also going to, you're going to have your loiter time is going to be short. You're not going to be able to do the kinds of things that we've done over the last 20 years. It's just going to be a real decrement in our counterterrorism capability. And we should be just honest and clear-eyed about it.
So, interesting question came up in several different parts. But at its heart is, how do we learn from mistakes in the national security enterprise? Right? How do we be clear-eyed and objective to ourselves, and then think it through and internalize it and change our behavior going forward? We do it every once in a while, but it's hard. Talk a little bit about that.
It's a great question again, and it's yes, we do it every once in a while, but we don't do it very well, and we as I said, we keep stumbling over some of the same problems. I mean, I think a lot of the things we did wrong with training the Afghan army are exactly the same things we did wrong with training the Vietnamese army in the 70s. And it's not like smart people didn't know that. I mean, Dave Petraeus wrote his doctoral dissertation on, how we did, what we did with the Vietnamese army in the counterinsurgency realm. So it's not like people weren't aware of this, or H.R. McMaster, who'd written his doctoral dissertation on, how the Joint Chiefs dealt with Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War. Look, it's very hard, first of all, because, policymaking, when we teach it in policy schools, and I teach in a policy school, we tend to make it this very abstract thing. There are these documents, these national security documents, strategy documents, etc. But as you know well, this is human beings, at work. It's like any other kind of human enterprise. And you've got people's egos involved. You've got people who are worried about, they're not worried about the reputational consequence to the United States of America necessarily. They're worried about the reputational consequence to them and what their next job is going to be, and whether they're going to get to go out and sit on a corporate board at some point or what have you. And so it is very, very hard once a policy is in place to make adjustments. I mean, General Eisenhower, who probably of any president, knew more about the strategy making process and the staffing process of any of them, said that, strategy was, great. It's good to have a strategy, but, you have to be prepared to adjust, or as Mike Tyson says, everybody's got a strategy until they get hit up on the side of the head. You've got to be able to adjust. And I think we did make an adjustment in Iraq, in 2007 with the surge, which I think was actually quite successful for a short time. I think, unfortunately, it got undone by our early exit in 2011. I mean, that's part of the problem. President Biden said, and it's a fair comment today, which is, when is the right time to leave? It's very hard to know when the right time, to leave is. But hopefully you don't want to leave when you get into these situations and leave behind what we're now leaving behind in Afghanistan. I think we ended up in a much better place in Iraq, even though we had to go back in, than we've ended up in Afghanistan. And I hope, by the way, we learned the right lesson from that, because there's some people who say, yeah, let's get everybody out of Syria and Iraq too. And I hope we don't do that, because I think that would be a very big mistake.
Shift gears for a little bit. A topic you and I and others have had to deal with, confirmation by the U.S. Senate. That process, which every student steps back and says, the Senate, by Constitution, has a right to provide its advice and consent to the president on the key positions that the president wants. But increasingly, regardless of who the president is, and almost regardless of the Senate structure, frankly, it's been harder and harder to get your team in office. We've got handfuls of the 60 Senate confirmed people in the Department of Defense, and even worse on the diplomatic side, right? The president's gotten very few of his recommended or his ambassadors through the confirmation process. How do you think about forget reforming the process? That's a much bigger question, much harder. But how do you think about getting as an administration, getting your trust and expertise in the field so that you get the connection between people you trust, people who know, and the policymakers back in Washington? How do you think about that as a former career ambassador who's also worked on the political side?
Yeah, so I mean, look, it's a terrible process, but as you say, it's enshrined in our Constitution. I worry that it's gotten so painful. I mean, it's it's never been a cakewalk, and every administration has nominations that blow up, for one reason or another. And Ken, as you know, having gone through the process, it's sort of like when you prepare your paperwork for confirmation, it's like going through an archaeological dig. You start getting questions that have to do not with your job or your background, but with the last failed nominee. Did you have a nanny who you didn't pay Social Security tax for? Have you ever committed adultery? Have you yelled at your staff and made them cry? I mean, with each failed nominee, there's some new set of strainer that you have to go through to kind of, get through the process. And I worry that the process is getting to the point. I mean, we've seen it in other administrations and in this administration. Some people are saying, I'm sorry, I'm just not willing to go through this. I'm not willing to have a financial proctological exam of all my finances. I'm not willing to put my life on hold. I mean, I know of one nominee in the previous administration who was on hold for, oh God, I don't know how long, over a year, and finally gave up and said, okay, I'm done. So we're going to lose a lot of people. My position on the board of directors of the U.S. Institute of Peace, actually Senate confirmed. It took me 18 months to get confirmed. I'd already been confirmed by the Senate 3 times for real jobs that I got paid for. But for this volunteer job that I don't get paid for, it took 18 months to get confirmed. I mean, it's crazy. I know that senators on both sides of the aisle feel that that the nomination process is one of the few ways they can get an administration's attention. And so the worst part of this is, look, there's some nominations, and we've seen some of this in the Biden administration, where people have run into problems because of tweeting on the tweets that they've put on Twitter. And I tell people, and not that I'm looking to get a Senate confirmed job again, because I have no desire for one, but I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on any social media, and more people ought to get off social media, I think, because if you want to be in government and you want to have a Senate confirmed job, you can bet they're going to comb through your tweets and find every stupid half-assed idea that you had that you decided you wanted to share with the rest of the world. And that that's been one set of problems. But the other problem we have is that some people get held up for something that is either totally tangential. I mean, I was held for 8 or 9 months by the then ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, the late Carl Levin. Had nothing to do with me. Senator Levin told me he liked me, but had to do with my predecessor, who he didn't like. But I was in no position to actually give him what it was he wanted, and it took 9 months, and it's debilitating. It makes it difficult for you to do your job while you're waiting to be confirmed. It makes it harder for the administration. And I've seen other examples of this. I mean, there's a recent example of a Defense Department Assistant Secretary who was just confirmed, but who was held up for a while because one member of the Senate didn't like the one answer that she had given in her confirmation hearing about a policy matter. I mean, really? Are we going to hold things up for that? I mean, look, I think my general going in presumption is whoever gets elected president ought to have the team of their choice and get their nominees ought to have a presumption of confirmation by the Senate, unless there's moral turpitude, criminality, or behavior that really suggests unfitness to hold the position they're in. And that could be revealed in their tweets. I mean, that's not illegitimate, but it ought to be one of those things and not, oh, I don't agree with the administration's policy on this, that, or the other thing. Senator Cruz is holding up everybody in the State Department over Nord Stream. I agree with him about Nord Stream. I think the administration's made a terrible mistake by not trying to shut down the Nord Stream pipeline and by waiving the sanctions. But does that mean they should hold up everybody who's being confirmed for the State Department? I think it's cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Thank you. Question, because I bet a lot of people don't in the audience don't know. What is the Institute of Peace and what's its role?
So the U.S. Institute of Peace was set up by law because at the time in the 1980s, a lot of people thought we had military academies, but we didn't have anything that, it was originally going to be a peace academy, but it ended up being an institute for peace. And USIP has done a variety of things, but in particular, they've done a lot of stuff over the last 20 years that has been enormously helpful to our efforts in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but also elsewhere in places like Libya, Colombia, places that are facing conflicts. And essentially, these are programs to help with conflict management, conflict prevention, so that we don't end up having situations that escalate into warfare. It's local reconciliation efforts, it's local mediation efforts, it's de-radicalization efforts. We've got a number of people in Kabul. I hope we can get them out, who've been involved in a lot of programs with local Afghan authorities to help deal with corruption and deal with other issues in the U.S. in the Afghan circumstance that are beneficial to the U.S. interest. It's our budget's about 35 million appropriated U.S. dollars. Sometimes it goes a little higher than that, but I think if you talk to military commanders where we've been involved, they will tell you that it's been a force multiplier, helped the United States overall, and helped in some areas prevent conflicts, or in some areas tamp them down. I mean, we played a not insignificant role in some of the success of the surge in dealing with local conflicts in Iraq, for instance.
Great, thank you. Switch gears again. What would be the downside of the U.S. becoming a regional power as opposed to a global power?
Yeah, that's it's a good question. And it's really essentially the debate we're having now. I mean, look, the United States for most of its history before World War I was in essence a regional power, in the age of sail, it made sense in some ways for the United States to be a regional power. We had at that time what one of my history professors at Yale, you mentioned my misspent youth in academia. C. Vann Woodward, who was the president of the American Historical Association, gave a presidential address in 1960 in which he said the United States had benefited from free security for most of its history because we've been separated from the rest of the world by two very large oceans. Some people took issue with that and pointed out that actually, for a lot of that time, we were protected by the Royal Navy, even though we didn't pay them, but they took it upon themselves to preserve the freedom of the seas, which therefore allowed the U.S. to sort of hide behind Great Britain's skirts a little bit. But his general point was right, I think, in terms of how Americans think about security or thought about it. But once the age of sail gave way to the age of steam and then transoceanic navies and air power, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, I think the idea that we could only be, that we could be a regional power, I think kind of went away. I think it's very hard for us to just be a regional power. Part of the issue is the system that we created that I talked about, the international order with the various international economic institutions and the system of alliances, requires somebody to manage it. And, Britain was able to give up its position of global dominance in the early 20th century because they could share the burden with us partially. But we don't have anybody we can hand off to. I don't think, if you think about how the People's Republic of China responded to a tweet by the general manager of the Houston Rockets about Hong Kong a year or two ago. A world run by the People's Republic of China would be like that, which is, oh, you tweet about Hong Kong? Well, all the Houston Rockets merchandise is going off the shelves in China, and you're going to lose a ton of money. So don't insult, the billion people of China by, your tweet. That's the kind of world we'll live in if the Chinese run it. And I don't think we want that. And I don't think most people in the rest of the world want that either.
Different shift. What do we learn from the Israelis and their defense philosophies? They're very effective at combining their diplomatic and defense capabilities, but they have a much different case than ours. But what do we learn by their ability to think about concepts and build capabilities?
Well, one capability that they've developed, which we've contributed to because we helped pay for it, was Iron Dome and David Sling. And because they're sitting in the midst of, an area that's bristling full of rockets and missiles, and they've got a neighbor in the north, a non-state actor, Hezbollah, that's got over 100,000 rockets and missiles in its arsenal. It's got the capability of several states worth of missile and rocket arsenals. What they've done is essentially developed an algorithm that allows them to defend those missiles that are coming towards populated areas and let the ones that are just going to fall into the water or into the desert just go unmolested. Now, that's great for conventional missiles. It's not quite good enough for nuclear because missile defense needs to be it needs to be perfect when it comes to nuclear or close to it. But I mean, I think obviously there are things we can learn from them, just scientifically. I mean, Israel is an incredibly advanced country, startup nation. They've got a lot of high tech. There's a lot to be learned. And there's a lot to be gained, I think, from partnerships between particularly the UAE and Israel that are being fostered by the Abraham Accords that President Trump's administration reached among Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. Sudan's less, I think, important, but so there's a lot, I think, to be gained there, and not the least being that the UAE has a lot of money at its disposal. Israel's got a lot of scientific talent. I think the next step, going back to those key, defense capabilities we were talking about earlier, future capabilities and technologies to invest in. I think the Israelis, even with all the strides they've made with Iron Dome and David Sling, which have diminished the cost per shot of their missile defense. But, no matter how much you diminish the cost, missile defense, as we see with what Hezbollah has done, puts you on the, or conventional missile defense, puts you on the wrong side of a cost imposition curve. It's a lot easier for them to proliferate the next generation of Al-Fajr missiles that, are going to have longer range and, bigger warheads than you can. It's going to be cheaper for them to do that than for you to come up with another interceptor to knock it down. So directed energy is obviously the place that we have to go. They have to go and we have to go. They could be, I think, the canaries in the coal mine for the next kind of generation of missile defense, with UAE money funding Israeli research on DE. I mean, we're already deploying some DE systems, as you know, on our ships, whether it's high-powered microwaves or lasers. But I think that's ultimately the way to get out of the cost imposition trap on missile defense, and we're going to need it because the missile threat is just proliferating like crazy around the world.
So one last one, and thanks again to the audience for coming up with some great questions. As we think about the changing nature of national security, one of the things you've seen multiple times coming out of looks at national strategy and defense strategy is the implications of global climate change. And trying to understand what they are, trying to draw them in. It's become quite politicized. And there's a separate challenge of how do you think about national security without always getting swung back and forth in the current debates and politics. But looking in particular at global climate change, what's that mean for a national strategy, a defense strategy, and how does the Department of Defense think about it, look at it, make a difference in it?
Well, DOD has been trying to make a difference for a while, and it's trying to reduce its carbon footprint. There's been a lot of effort. Secretary Carter actually put a lot of effort into that when he was Secretary of Defense. And I think that's all to the good. I mean, the biggest, and climate, by the way, I should add, one of the differences between the Trump national security strategy and national defense strategy and the Biden interim strategic guidance is very much an emphasis by the Biden folks on climate and the impacts of climate change. Having said that, it's never very clear exactly how it fits in. One very direct way, I mean, obviously we'd all be better off if we moved it more in the direction of renewable energy and relied less on fossil fuels, although fossil fuels are going to play a role for quite some time to come. I think we have to be realistic about that as well. Also, I think nuclear is going to have to be a part of this solution to this, and that there's some uncomfortable problems with, waste removal and storage, et cetera, that come with nuclear. But I think Germany is about having banned nuclear, but also having signed on to the Paris Accords. And the Germans are about to discover, that, there's something's got to give there. The French already have pretty much a plutonium economy, as do the Japanese, so they're in better shape. Germans will, I think, be facing some acute challenges, which is one reason why the Greens are doing so well politically in Germany. The biggest thing I see that affects DoD, Ken, is the fact that climate change is doing two things. First, it's driving people to migrate more to alluvial floodplains, and it's creating more catastrophic weather events that tend to hit those, megalopolises that have been created by that migration. And we in DoD, when I say we in DoD, old habits die hard. But in DoD, obviously, we have the kind of resident capabilities for planning and for disaster relief that mean those resources are going to get drawn on more often. Now, people complain about that from time to time because it obviously takes away from the defense mission. But I mentioned at the outset that one of the things that's been part of our strategy for national strategy for a long time is when people run into disasters, Americans help. That's just it's part of our DNA. So it's going to be an ongoing mission. We have the mercy, we have the hope, we've got certain assets that can be deployed when these things happen, and we should deploy them. But I think it means that we're going to have those mission sets more and more in the future because of climate change. That's going to be, I think, the most direct impact on defense strategy and making sure we have those assets available.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you for taking the time to join us at Seminars of Steamboat. We really appreciate your insights. As always, we lead these tough conversations with as many questions as we have answers, but the hope is that we at least try to, or our hope is that we inform the public policy debate and try to bring in views of that policy that help you interpret what's going on and hopefully in time make you a better citizen. So Eric, we really appreciate your time with us. To the audience, thank you very much for tuning in and for asking such great questions. Have a great evening and thank you all.
Thanks, Ken.